Hey guys, welcome back to today's video. Today is Saturday, August 13th, 2022, and today we're going to be taking a look at the 2022 Senate elections as of today in terms of what the polling says about these races. Now, I will first say that I do not believe that the result of this Senate map is how our Senate map will be. I know there will be some people who will try to misconstrue this as a prediction. It is not a prediction, and that is definite. This is more so just taking the aggregate of the polls that have been taken in many of these states and applying it to our map. Some states that we don't even talk about have polls that show the race as being more competitive than you otherwise might think. And the reason for that is because largely in many of these states, you have one or two or three polls that have been taken throughout the entirety of the election cycle, and thus the average might be skewed by a one-off poll or a two-off poll that shows either result in a different expectation or a different result from what might be expected for these Senate seats. But I will say that a lot of the polls that we do see also do make a bit of sense. Some of these states have been heavily polled. You see a poll come out of the state every single week, sometimes multiple times a week, and those are the states where I tend to trust the polls a lot more. There are some states where I've seen a poll from July, one in August, and then that's it for the entirety of the state. Yes, maybe those polls can be accurate, but at the end of the day, they aren't really being tested by anything within a similar time frame, so I tend to trust them less. So let's go ahead and get started and move over from the West Coast to the East Coast, just because these West Coast states are a little bit less exciting in terms of competitiveness than the ones on the East Coast. No shade towards them, but it is just going to be a lot more interesting as we get closer to the Eastern Shore. So let's get started. On the West Coast, we have Washington, Oregon, California. These are three states that we routinely characterize as pretty solid for the Democratic Party. You don't really see that wavering much. Now, following the Washington primary, the Republican Party practically needs to give up any chance that they thought they had in the state of Washington, and they probably are. You don't really see many initiatives going into the state because realistically, it isn't that winnable of a seat. But based off the polls that we have thus far, the Democrat there is only ahead by a likely margin. Now, the margins are explained in the description box down below, so looking at this likely margin, it isn't a bad result for the Democratic Party. It also is one of those states that I was talking about where you have very few and infrequent polling that makes it difficult to see where the actual average is, because some of them are taken quite literally months apart. So, again, it is more difficult to really pinpoint to see what the difference is and to see how things are changing between month after month. So the state of Washington starts off as likely blue, but the state of Oregon is safe blue based off the numbers that we have there. California has not been polled, surprisingly enough, or I guess more so unsurprisingly, because it is a very big state, which means you need a lot of money to poll the state. It's a lot easier to poll in a state that has a much smaller population than a one as large as California. You need to get a bunch of different demographics in California. Some other states, it's a little bit easier. So I will say that it makes sense that there is no data, especially for a state that is so solidly Democratic. Moving over to the state of Idaho, that one is a very solid Republican state. I don't believe there's any polling there on the GOP side or any polling in general, but the GOP is very easily going to win the state of Idaho. So we can really just revert it back to what we really understand about these states. Moving down to the state of Nevada, Catherine Cortez Masto is narrowly ahead of Adam Laxalt in this race. Makes a bit of sense. Sometimes the polls overestimate Republican support in the state, so I'm quite interested to see what happens. I think pretty consistently, actually, from 2016 to 2018 to 2020, that the Democratic Party's actual vote share was higher than what the polls had predicted, and that Republicans on the overall average were expected to do better. I think in 2018, they said that the Democratic nominee for Senate was going to lose. The governorship was also going to go to the GOP, neither of which happened. In 2016, they said Hillary Clinton was going to lose the race there. I also believe they said the Senate race was going to go to the GOP. So the polls in the state of Nevada were off, contrary to practically every other state being off for the Democrats, but in this state it was off for the Republicans, so I'm interested to see if that happens this time around. The state of Utah is likely red. Right now, incumbent Senator Mike Lee is facing off against another Republican, Evan McMullin, who the Democrats endorsed and chose not to run anyone against. Right now, he's polling about 9 points on average ahead. The state of Alaska is solid red. The top two contenders in every single poll are two Republicans, so realistically, the party change isn't happening. Hawaii is a safe blue state. No polls there, but still very solid for the Democrats. And in the state of Arizona, the Democrats are ahead by a very astounding margin. You're talking 9 points across this state. Now, I don't know if I necessarily believe that 9 points is realistic, but I do believe that the sentiment right now in the state is that Mark Kelly is on track for victory and voters want him in the Senate again. I think that's what we sort of see right now from the state of Arizona. And while I do not expect a 9-point margin of victory by November, as indicated by the light model here, I do expect Mark Kelly to win by the end of the day. And, taking a look at the odds actually in terms of chances at victory based off the polls itself, a little bit of a spoiler, but you practically could predict based off who was going to win, based off some of the results I've already given you thus far. Democrats have about an 80% chance at retaining control of the Senate if these polls were to be perfectly accurate. But then again, obviously, they're not going to be. but it's always interesting to take a look at. The state of Colorado, likely blue based off the numbers that we have. I also agree with that characterization. That's practically how I've had Colorado for quite some time. So I'd say, Democrats aren't going to lose the state right now. It doesn't really seem to be within the realm of possibility, but everything is within the realm of possibility within American politics. But it is very highly unlikely. North and South Dakota, solid red states. Kansas, another solid red state. Both of Oklahoma seats, solid red. So the GOP already starting to pick up from 32 to 37. Moving over to the state of Arkansas, safe red. Louisiana, safe red. No real moments of contention there for the Republican Party. But in the neighboring state of Missouri, actually neighbors three of the states that I just characterized as safe red, it's actually a likely state. Now, I don't buy that. I think that by the results that we see in November, we will expect Eric Schmidt, the Republican nominee, to have over 55% of the vote. Considering where we are nationally, the environment is better based off polls than where it was in 2018, is better based off polls where it was in 2020, and I think that's enough, especially in a solid red state such as Missouri. There's no realistic possibility that it is competitive, but the polls do seem to say that it is a likely margin. You're hovering around 12 to 13 points in favor of Eric Schmidt, the Republican nominee. The state of Iowa, this is a likely red state according to the polls. I've had it as safe red. I don't know if I'm going to keep it as safe red based off of a very reputable and trusting pollster within the state of Iowa. We actually saw the most accurate one in 2016 and 2020, got Trump's victory nearly right on the money. In the state of Iowa, they are saying that Chuck Grassley wins by 8 points statewide. In every election prior to that, he's won by a larger margin. He's been serving in the U.S. Senate for over 40 years now. So if he is to win this race, he will be serving for an additional 6. But based off the numbers that we have, it looks like he is on track to win re-election in the state of Iowa. Moving over to the state of Illinois, the Democrats are ahead there. Tammy Duckworth up by, I think, 9-10 points. I don't buy that. I think she wins by larger than that. But again, only one poll out of the state of Illinois. Similar story that we've been seeing across the country. Very few polls, very few pollsters in some of these states, so we're taking what we have, and it isn't always the most accurate. In the state of Wisconsin, again, a state with just 2 singular polls. One actually nonpartisan poll that shows Mandela Barnes ahead by, I believe, 2 points. Another poll shows him tied, so the average there was that Mandela Barnes wins by about 1, but it's still, a competitive state. But on the overall average, we expect the Democrats to lose the state of Wisconsin based off of where it stands today. Moving over to the state of Indiana and Kentucky and Alabama, these are solid red states. Democrats aren't going to win there, and the polls don't seem to be giving them false hope either. The state of Florida, on the other hand, does seem to be giving them at least somewhat false hope. It is predicting that Marco Rubio does win, but by the margins here, just simply aren't realistic. In 2016, Rubio won by 8 on the same ballot that Trump won by 1. So in a year better than 2016, better than 2018, better than 2020 in the generic ballot, well, you can argue that Florida is going to be more conservative, and I agree. The state of Georgia is a very highly polled state. You see polls coming out of Georgia left and right, Republican internals, Democratic internals, nonpartisan polls, and overall the average here is that Warnock wins by about 4 points. I would say that, I trust the ones in Georgia more than I trust in many other states, simply because we've seen a lot of our shares of partisan polls, nonpartisan polls, and the average here has been changing every single time a new poll comes into the mix. But overall, the very general consensus here, even amongst Republican internals, is that Raphael Warnock does win the Senate race. So for right now, we're going to characterize it as lean blue because that's what the average says. South Carolina, safe red. North Carolina, surprisingly enough, based off the numbers that we have, is very competitive. Now, I currently have it as a state that is not very competitive. I have it as likely red. I'm expecting Ted Budd to win by about 6 to 7 points. I honestly think he's one of the stronger nominees that the GOP has nominated. I think the Democratic Party, would have lucked out if Pat McCrory had won the nomination, but they didn't. Sherry Beasley is a strong candidate, but this simply isn't her year. And North Carolina is a state that Trump won in both 2016 and 2020, so it's reasonable to expect in a year better for the GOP that they win it. They also have, again, a congressman who is the better version of the Republican nominee that could have been there, and he was endorsed by Trump. I think that he poses a very good shot at winning the Senate race, and I don't believe that the margin will be less than 1%, at least as of right now. So for right now, North Carolina, and my overall prediction is likely red, but based off the polls, only seem to be showing Ted Budd ahead by less than a point, which is quite interesting, if you ask me. Even the Republican poll there, Trafalgar has the Republicans ahead by 3 points statewide. They're pretty accurate sometimes, inaccurate in others. I wouldn't say that I trust them above all, but it is a Republican internal showing the Republicans ahead by just 3. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe North Carolina will narrow down, and that's something we have to wait and see for. The next state that has polls, a lot of them, surprisingly enough, is the state of Ohio. Now, a lot of these polls are done by I guess what we would call not as, not the best quality pollsters, not to say that these are bad polls, but I do think that they are missing a mark. I think we are going to see Ohio go red on the Senate level. I absolutely expect that, but take a look at the difference here. I mean, everyone's expecting that. Ohio on the overall polling average gives Tim Ryan a 70% chance of victory, expected to win by 5. You flip it over to the classic model, what do you find? The Republican jumps ahead, up 55 to 45. Then you add in expert ratings when people actually know the state and understand the political demographics and the past election results, and what do you find? Ohio becomes a likely red state. J.D. Vance, the Republican, has a 75% chance of victory at that point. So when you see the difference, what goes from a 70% chance for the Democrat down to 25, when you actually add in expert ratings, it tells you a lot about what we can expect this November and why the polls aren't always accurate. But for instance, in states such as Georgia, Herschel Walker's ahead 51 to 49. Based off the polls, he's ahead 65 to 35. A significant difference, but not significant enough to say that it's a different victor by the end of it. Or, for instance, in the state of New Hampshire, Maggie Hassan has a 72% chance of victory based off the polls. Based off the deluxe model, she actually has a 75% chance of victory. So sometimes the polls are underestimating Democrats, but generally speaking, some of these more highly polled states are able to predict and pinpoint the victor more accurately than otherwise might be expected. Moving over to the next state of Pennsylvania, the Democrats are ahead here by a likely margin, a very solid one if you ask me. Based off the overall deluxe model, John Fetterman has a 67% chance of victory. Based off the light model, though, it skyrockets to 90%. 67 to 90, a big difference, but still, the victor is correct by the end of the day based off of both models. Maryland, New York, very easy states to see in the Democratic column. The numbers seem to indicate it as well. Vermont, also a very solid state for the Democrats, and Democrats already gain a seat. So we are already at a point where the Democratic Party is at 51, the Republicans are at 47, and in Connecticut, it becomes likely blue. Very few polls in the state, wouldn't be alarmed at all. That's just something that, Democrats are going to maybe have to worry about, but never, really, realistically speaking, the polls might say this is a competitive race, but realistically it isn't. And then the state of New Hampshire is surprisingly enough closer than what the actual expected margin is according to FiveThirtyEight. So the results here are a 53 to 47 Democratic majority. That's significant. If this was to hold true, we would call 2022 a blue tsunami year. If Democrats were able to flip Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, Ohio. Pennsylvania is much more realistic than Ohio, much more realistic than Wisconsin, but Wisconsin is still reasonable. Ohio is absolutely not. If Tim Ryan is able to win in the state of Ohio, he should be the Democratic nominee for president in 2024 because that shows he can win in these Trumpy areas, Trumpy districts, Trumpy states that other Democrats simply have been unable to tap into. I mean, maybe it's because he's from the state of Ohio. Obviously, that's something that benefits him, and I'm not trying to make the case here for 2024. It's a very hypothetical if he has, the long shot chance and wins the Ohio Senate race. But based off of these polls alone, it does show that at least something might be off in Ohio. Something might be off in the state of Wisconsin. This map is a lot more colorful than what we're used to. And again, that's because many of these states have polls that have been taken months apart and some that only have 1 or 2 polls that really don't give us the whole picture. And that's the problem here. But this 53 to 47 majority is definitely not anything that I personally will expect. I personally ever expected for the Democratic Party and is seemingly, outside of the realm of possibility. But for the GOP, for them to have 53 to 47, that's realistic. If Republicans are able to capture Georgia, Arizona, and hold on to the states they have and capture New Hampshire, or even Nevada, then they would have 53 to 47, or in a worst case for Democrats, 54 to 46, or in an even worse case, 55 to 45 if the Republicans flip the state of Colorado. What I see happening, though, based off the polls that we have, is that some of these states I trust. I think that I trust Georgia. I think that I trust Arizona. I think that I trust Pennsylvania. Do I believe that in November these will be the actual results? Probably not in Pennsylvania and Arizona, but in Georgia, maybe. Seeing a margin victory of 3 to 4 points wouldn't be that unrealistic. Raphael Warnock won by 2 in the past. Arizona and Pennsylvania probably are having, their surges for the Democratic Party. I expect it to decrease away from the Democratic Party's lead. I think that, what we will see on Election Day is potentially Fetterman up by 3 and Kelly up by 4 or something similar to that. And if we do see that, Democrats probably will win the states. I don't think these margins will hold true, but what I do think is that the victors will hold true. But in the states of Wisconsin and Ohio, I don't trust them. Ohio has had, again, low-quality polls in the state that I don't imagine to be, the most accurate. And again, I'm not here trying to question the validity of them too intently, but I do want to say that I personally do not want to put too much standing or a foundation in my prediction based off of these polls that have been taken when there have been very little reputable pollsters, or at least mainstream and very well-known pollsters within the state. I'm excited to see when actual more numbers come out of the state. There have been some more recent ones. I think Democratic internals that show Tim Ryan ahead by 3 points or maybe down 3 points. Not entirely sure what it showed, but the overall average here was that the Democrats were ahead in Ohio. Wisconsin is a severely underpolled state. There's only been one that shows the Democratic contender against the Republican contender, and it was before the primary even occurred. So we are in a waiting game for some of these polls, for some of these states. But honestly, we might not get a lot of data out of the ones that we expect to, such as Ohio and Wisconsin. Some of those states are going to be seen as lost causes for the Democratic Party, and thus pollsters won't want to spend too much money rating the states, or news media companies might not want to be diving too deep into states that they don't necessarily need to be worrying about. But the final map here, 53 to 47. The main takeaways I would take from this Senate map is that polls make sense in some states, but not in others. And it's important to know the distinction between them. We don't trust the ones in Ohio because of election history, because of fundraising numbers, because of just overall partisanship across the state. It makes sense that the GOP is ahead, but the polls don't say that. So I wouldn't say I trust the polls over practically every other sign saying the GOP will be ahead in the state of Ohio. On the other hand, in the state of Georgia, it might be weird to see a Democrat ahead in a red wave year such as this one, but based off the candidate that we have, based off the fundraising numbers, and based off the last election results in which the Democratic incumbent senator there outperformed President Biden just 2 months later, it makes sense that he might be pulling ahead. So keep in mind, there are some states that make sense, some states that don't, and it's important to know the difference between the two. And if you're watching this video, you probably have already heard me talk about them, or probably already know which ones make sense and which ones don't. Some states also, again, as I've been saying throughout this entirety of this video, some states have such bad quality polls or such infrequent polling that makes it very difficult to get a genuine aggregate of what the polls are telling us. It's snapshots at periods of time and sometimes inaccurate polls that completely skew the margins, which is why Utah is likely red, why North Carolina is tilt red, why Washington and Connecticut and Illinois are somehow competitive in this cycle. These are things that don't make sense, as I said previously, but it has to do with the fact that the polls here are bad quality or infrequent. Ohio isn't infrequent, but I will say that it probably fits in the first section of that category. And the final thing here is that ultimately, trust what you want to. These polls are not to be taken to heart. These polls are not to be taken as, full-on expert opinion when it comes down to political predictions. Again, there's a reason why my map looks a lot different than this one. Why have the Democrats winning 3 less Senate seats than what the polls actually predict? Many people would like to argue that I, blindly trust the polls, and I don't think that I do. Because otherwise, I would have a Senate map that is much more favorable for the Democratic Party, and I don't. In addition to that, I would just say that trust what you want to personally. There's no harm in saying that I don't believe. I'm from Pennsylvania. I think Dr. Oz is going to win. Sure, that opinion is totally fair to have. As someone who's a resident from the state or someone who's just looking at it from the outside, polls aren't here to be this God source or prophecy of what we will see in November. Yes, they are helpful indicators, but they are by no means the gold standard, and we need to recognize that, especially after 2016 and 2020. I try not to put too much merit and trust into the polls. I do think that they do tell a story, especially if they are reputable pollsters, Fox News, New York Times, Washington Post, these media organizations and companies that have millions of dollars of funding that go into their methodology, that go into the way that they do these polls, so I tend to trust them. But sometimes the firms aren't the most accurate, and even them can be wrong, as we saw in past election cycles. So just take all of that away from you. I hope it gives you a better understanding, and I hope it gives you a better understanding of where our Senate map looks right now based off of the polls that we have. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below. Subscribe on the left if you haven't already, and check out the Instagram and Twitter. At the bottom left of the screen, there's also a Discord server for you to go ahead and join. On the screen, there's a video you can watch, and then a playlist for my 2022 Senate election analysis videos. Again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all later today.